All right. Well, today, again, our word is equip. And I wanted to start this morning by telling you a story about my first year of college. You see, all through college, I had the privilege of doing a work-study job through dining services. Now, my sophomore through senior year, it really was a privilege. I got to work in the dining services office, which most people didn't know existed, and mostly it meant that, officially I was there to answer the phone, but mostly it meant that I got paid to do my homework, which was awesome. but the first year I did a whole wide variety of jobs in the dining services realm. I worked in the dish room, and I worked on the line, and I put the food in the buffet line, and I cleaned it up, and I did all of those sorts of things. But my favorite job there, and they only let me do it a couple times the way that this schedule worked, but my favorite job was when I got to work in the bake shop with the cook. And they still made, I don't know why, but they made cookies from scratch, not just frozen little globs of dough that you set on a cookie tray. They really made cookies there. And the first time I walked in and they showed me how the process worked, I was astounded. There was a KitchenAid mixer as tall as I was, and a great big bowl, and then they showed me the oven. And I had never worked in a commercial kitchen, and so this oven has this huge door, and you slide it up, and there are inside trays. They're like 5 feet long, 4 feet deep, something like that, and they spin around and around. There's like 4 or 5 of them, and they spin around so that you can make like 1,000 cookies at a time, which was pretty much my dream. It was amazing. And as I was there experiencing this new world of cooking, I thought I had no idea that there were tools for this. I didn't know that there was a mixer that was that big. I didn't know that you could have ovens that were enormous. I did know about walk-in freezers, but they're still kind of amazing, aren't they? An entire room filled with frozen food. It's unreal. Sometimes it's good to have the equipment that you need because, of course, if you're trying to feed thousands of people, you need good equipment to feed thousands of people. You can't use a little dinky oven with 2 racks, right? You need a good one that's got lots of room for cookies and other things. And so I found that if you're going to do a job, it's good to have the right tool. So for those of you who aren't wild about cooking, try to apply that in some other way. When you go to the hardware store or the office supply store, the shoe store, it's good to know that there's the right tool for the right job, right? You wouldn't want to go running in heels, and you wouldn't want to try to do advanced calculus with a little tiny calculator. You pick the right tool for the right job. And then, on a more serious note, we think about what it's like to not have the right tool. How when you have a friend that's struggling with depression and you feel like, I don't have the tools for counseling, it's scary. When you don't have the right tools, but you have a family member struggling with alcoholism, or when you're struggling to be a good parent, or to be a good spouse, or to just figure out what the next step of life is, and you don't have the right tools, it's really hard, isn't it? Life can be hard when you feel unequipped. So today we're going to, again, think about equip and how God equips us and how we as the church can help you to feel equipped. But before that, I want to quickly review where we've been. So we've had this series that we've called Building the Church. And of course, it's not about building bricks and mortar. Building the church is really at its heart, at the most basic point, it's about building disciples. And that's what we've been wanting to focus on, how to build disciples. Now, you know that every great building plan needs a good blueprint. Every great plan for success needs a pathway. And so we've come up with a pathway. Now, it's not a super specific pathway because we know that you can build 1,000 different kinds of buildings with the same basic structure. And you can build, God has 1,000 different personalities plus, obviously, and there's thousands of ways to build disciples. But we think there are some basic steps that you should follow, like get a firm foundation, put on a roof, add some walls, things like that. And so we've got 4 E words to help you think about what the discipleship pathway might look like: encounter, engage, equip, and empower. And so we've been exploring this pathway. Oh, and I didn't bring my connection up, but if you're wondering about that, somebody asked me last week, what are those 4 words that you guys have been talking about? They're actually on the front of the connection in a little box: engaging, encountering, engaging, empowering, equipping. They're in the right order even. So anyway, that's where we've been. And we've been trying to help us think about that pathway by thinking about how Jesus encountered and engaged and equipped and empowered the disciples. So he began on the lakeshore with Peter and Andrew and James and John, and he walked along and he said, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And Pastor Don was here that week, and he talked about how surprising it was that Jesus would encounter them that way. How extraordinary it was that while they were doing their ordinary job, while they were in their regular, average, everyday life, that Jesus would walk along and encounter them and call them to something special. And of course, Jesus does that for us as well. And then the next week, last week, Brad talked about engage, and we looked at a mission trip, so to speak, that Jesus sent his disciples on. And it was being engaged in ministry right away, going to the lost sheep of Israel and jumping right into ministry. And so we've talked about all of these things, and today, again, our word is equipping. Now, I think you could make a case for arguing that Jesus has been equipping the disciples all along. He told them, first of all, what their call was, that they were to fish for people. And then he spends, that's in Matthew chapter 4, then Matthew 5 through 7, he spends giving them the Sermon on the Mount and giving them all sorts of important instructions. He then tells the disciples and shows them that he has power over the wind and the waves and over illness, and he heals people and he calms the storm. And then chapter 10, he's been calling people in the midst of this, and in chapter 10, he finalizes that list of disciples and immediately sends them out into ministry and says, you need to be engaged here. And I think I said last week that there's something about being asked to do what you've been hearing that makes you learn it better. Sometimes you think you know when you hear somebody describe it, but until you actually are in the deep end trying to do it, you don't know if you know it or not. So they go into the deep end and they do all of this mission work. And then they come back and there's more teaching, but this time it has a darker tone. And so Jesus spends the next several chapters saying things like, there will be persecution coming, and I've not come to bring peace but a sword, and woe to you unrepentant cities. And then he starts getting in trouble with the Pharisees. He eats on the Sabbath, and he heals on the Sabbath, and he's messing with their system, and things are starting to get a little more intense. And all of this time, Jesus has been equipping those disciples, getting them ready for what's to come. And as this tension builds, we read Matthew 14, which is one long, stressful day for Jesus and the disciples. It begins in the morning with news that John the Baptist has died. Now, John the Baptist, you may know, was Jesus' cousin or relative, and And that's important, and I think he grieved for his family member, but there's something else about John the Baptist that I think added to his grief and distress, and that is that John the Baptist was the Elijah, the prophet that would come to prepare the way for the Messiah. And Jesus has told his disciples this. He said that John the Baptist is playing the role of Elijah here and getting the way ready for my own ministry. So when John the Baptist is publicly executed, it means that Jesus' death is inching ever closer. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but he knows that it's coming ever closer. And so there's grief and emotional stuff to deal with. And so he tries to withdraw, Jesus does, with his disciples away to a deserted place, and the crowds follow. And then there's our story for today. And then afterwards, if you keep reading, there's the story about walking on water. And again, not being afraid and not being distracted by the wind and the waves. But today we want to focus on this part where Jesus sees this great crowd as he's trying to withdraw. And instead of getting angry with them, he has compassion on them. And he heals the sick, and he tells the people that they are loved. And as the day draws to a close, the disciples come and they pull Jesus aside and they say, it's time. It's time to send those guys away. It's time to let them go eat their own food, to go to the villages. And Jesus says, in this terribly frustrating way, perhaps, I think it might have been frustrating to hear, he says, they do not need to go away. You give them food. You give them food. And I think the disciples, I can't imagine what they must have felt like if they laughed at him or if they just stood with their mouths hanging open. They do not have the tools to feed this crowd. They would need one of those gigantic mixers or one of those magic ovens that has the 4 trays, right? They would need something enormous to feed thousands of people, but they don't have it. They have nothing, and they feel so ill-equipped for the task of feeding the people. Feed them? Surely Jesus was joking, right? Surely he was kidding, but he wasn't. And thus begins the best lesson in equipping that they will experience. Because you see, when it comes to serving God's people, you don't need to have the whole Pampered Chef catalog at your disposal, and you don't need to have degrees upon degrees in theology. What you need is to pay attention to the gifts and the resources that God has already given you, and then you need to pray. Jesus says, "Bring me what you have." Well, they only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, which is obviously just a small fraction of what they need. But this does not matter, because step 1 in being well equipped is bring your stuff to Jesus. Bring what you've got to Jesus. Corrie ten Boom once wrote, "I believe that the experiences of our lives, when we let God use them, become the mysterious and perfect preparation for the work he will give us to do." I believe that the experiences of our lives, when we let God use them, will become the mysterious and perfect preparation for the work that he has for us to do. You may not know a lot about the Bible, but perhaps your background in trucking and the answered prayers you've received may be just exactly what God needs for you to teach someone else. You may not know a lot about counseling, but you do know about the power of a friend during times of grief, because you've been there and you know how to be a friend. You may not know a lot about being a missionary in a foreign country, but you might know how to use the bus system and be able to help someone in need who stops by the church on Sunday morning and says, "I've got to get from here to there." And then as you help them, you become a missionary right then and there. You see, the experiences of our lives, when we allow God to use them, become the mysterious and perfect preparation for the work he will give us to do. It doesn't matter how insignificant you think your resources are, because when you bring your stuff to Jesus, it's more than enough. Right now, Dave Roberts is leading a Lenten study about Moses, and Moses is a great example of this too, right? Moses, standing in front of the burning bush, says, I am not ready. I don't have enough stuff to go and do what you think I need to do. But God had been working in the background all the time, getting him ready in Pharaoh's court to know how to negotiate with Pharaoh, getting him ready, living in the wilderness, herding sheep, knowing how to survive there. He had exactly the right tools and the right resources for the work that God had called him to. And so too do we. When we bring our meager offerings to God, God makes it perfect. Because the reality is, even if you had 12 PhDs and lots of training, you still wouldn't have enough stuff to do the work of God. Because what we really need to do God's work is the Holy Spirit working through us. We can never be fully equipped until we bring it all to Jesus. Now, to return to our story, when the disciples give what they have to Jesus, he takes their offerings and he prays over them. He gives thanks and blesses them and then gives it back. And I think that this is so powerful, praying over the things that Jesus gives and wanting to bless them and give them back out. Giving thanks for what God has done. And when we give thanks, it reshapes who we are and what God has done. So 2 basic steps for being equipped in ministry. Number 1, give your stuff to Jesus. And number 2, pray over that stuff and give thanks and allow God to work. Now, I know that might not seem like enough. You might want more things. And indeed, there are lots of resources in our world. There's lots of resources on how to read the Bible or how to hear God's voice or how to pray or how to do all sorts of things, how to go on a mission trip. But to give a sermon on any one of those specifics would have been to miss the fact that each situation is unique. And what we really need to know is that we are not alone. You see, there's a whole room full of people right here, and they've all got special experiences, and when you start talking to them, they will help to lead and guide you in your faith. And you can read the words of the saints that have gone before in books and ministry, but best of all, we have Jesus, the one who's able to provide when we don't have enough. Let us trust Jesus to give us what we need at just the right moment. Let's pray together.